We are the California Mobility Justice Advocates, a network of organizations and individuals across the state who are committed to advocating for policies and initiatives that advance transportation equity and mobility justice. In this video, we'd like to share a little bit about why we do what we do and why it matters. Mobility justice is about the right and ability to move freely, to be able to access jobs, education, affordable housing and healthcare, and other opportunities and services.
Mobility justice is about recognizing and reconciling the historical and current injustices experienced by communities of color and low-income communities at the hands of corporations and governments.
Mobility justice is about empowering Black, Indigenous people of color, especially people who are disabled, migrants, people experiencing homelessness, youth, elders, queer folks, and other groups who have been historically marginalized, to be leaders and decision makers of our own communities now.
Mobility justice is ensuring that impacted communities have the space, resources, and capacity to envision and realize their own solutions to transportation, mobility, and safety issues in their communities.
So how did we get here? Why mobility justice? Well, for thousands of years, Indigenous people have stewarded the region called California. At one point, the Indigenous people of California collectively spoke over 300 different dialects in 90 languages. The invasion, first by Spain and later by the US, was devastating to the Indigenous people's languages, culture, and sacred lands. These horrendous events still show up today, with higher poverty rates, less access to safe and affordable drinking water, and higher arrest and suicide rates than the general population. Additionally, as a result of poor infrastructure investments, reservations and rural Native communities have limited transportation options, which result in some of the higher rates of pedestrian mortality. One of the more devastating acts is the continued exclusion of Native people from the design and planning process on their own homelands.
But the racism and discrimination doesn't just end there. Redlining was the institutionalized and systemic practice of government partnering with realtors and banks to draw literal red lines around communities of color and deny them loans to buy homes, open businesses, and build intergenerational wealth. And while redlining was eventually outlawed in 1968, the racist policy still has enduring impacts today. Across the country, highways were constructed directly through these redlined communities of color, which worsened air pollution and detrimental health impacts. This neglect and disinvestment of the inner cities across the US only further disenfranchised communities of color and worsened access to good jobs, housing, education, and transportation options.
In 2020, the COVID pandemic and the economic fallout has shown just how vast the social and economic racial disparities are and how they continue to plague our country. Black and brown families and Pacific Islanders are dying, facing housing challenges, and losing jobs at higher rates, while also making up a disproportionate number of our essential and frontline workers who are required to risk their lives and health for a paycheck. Transit workers are also facing some of the worst challenges with limited resources to protect themselves.
The current situation is exposing how the lack of a strong social safety net like universal basic income and access to affordable healthcare for all can have a negative impact on low-income families and communities of color. As mobility justice advocates, our main priority is transportation equity and how it impacts and relates to these intersectional issues that affect our community every day. These contextual frames are what drove us to craft the Mobility Justice Advocates Guiding Principles. We are excited to announce the release of this document, and we, the Mobility Justice Advocates, put forth a set of principles that guide our work as a network in the hopes of encouraging decision makers to center community voice and wisdom in mobility and transportation programs and projects. The purpose of the Mobility Justice Principles is to respond to a growing cry for deeper, more genuine, equitable, justice-based, and community-led approaches to city planning and designing of our built environment. And these principles also serve as a lens for how the Mobility Justice Advocates Network weighs in on advocacy, research, implementation, and other avenues. Our guiding principles are divided into 3 categories.
Centering community means nothing about us without us. In order for BIPOC residents to achieve full self-determination, we must be fully empowered at all levels. These voices should drive the planning, design, and implementation processes. This means that best practices are defined and led by local BIPOC communities. It means that community voices are essential in data and decision making, that BIPOC leaders, experts, and decision makers have authentic power, that accessibility is intersectional, and that BIPOC communities develop their own solutions for street safety that are not grounded in policing and enforcement, but instead invest in services and infrastructure that actually help keep residents safe and healthy.
Local indigenous groups carry ancient knowledge in stewarding California lands. Additionally, BIPOC long-term residents have the expertise in their own communities about how to build just and equitable neighborhoods. However, what is often missing is the capacity to meaningfully engage in the political and planning processes. Accountability is also a key component of capacity. If government processes and policies were actually reflective of and co-designed by communities they serve, there would be less need for residents and advocates to spend all their time keeping agencies' officials accountable. To summarize, in order to meaningfully increase capacity, system, processes, and structures must be unequivocally accessible and reflective of BIPOC communities. BIPOC communities and their trusted organizations must be given the capacity and resources to actually shape outcomes. And finally, government must build their own capacity to acknowledge and reconcile the past harms they committed to communities.
There is a history of disinvestment in our BIPOC communities. Meaningful change will require thoughtful and serious resources and funding to repair the harm that's been caused over centuries. Government resources must be allocated to involving the community in decision-making and planning processes. But what does this exactly look like? This means BIPOC communities are meaningfully invested in with progressive revenue sources, with dedicated funding pots. This means BIPOC communities are paid at market rates as professional experts, just like consultants. This means participatory budgeting is standardized across California. And finally, this means all mobility investments are providing multiple and intersectional benefits.
We hope these principles will provide guidance to residents, community organizers, activists, city planners, researchers, and policymakers as we design and reinvest in our neighborhoods. For more information, please take a look at our guiding principles document. And if you're interested in collaborating or joining the Mobility Justice Advocates, please email myself, Axel Santana, at asantana@policylink.org. Together, we can make California more just, equitable, healthy, and sustainable for all.